There's been some very interesting comments about King Charles and the Princess of Wales and this allegation of racism. I think it's important to get it out there. I think it's important to defend the royal family from these allegations. And I think it's important to try to build bridges rather than to burn bridges. And the Obid Scobie thing needs to be exposed. It doesn't matter what he says to various people on BBC, on ITV, doing the round of breakfast television, doing the round of interviews, and claiming that he wasn't responsible for these names. As somebody pointed out last night in an interview on the BBC, I think, almost certainly those names were in an early draft. And he has said himself that it wasn't legally prudent to name the people. So presumably he did receive legal advice. So presumably these names were excised from a later edition, and it was the earlier edition that was translated in the Netherlands and then put out without proper oversight. But it doesn't really matter for Obid Scobie to claim that he didn't know and it wasn't something he'd written is, I think, disingenuous and rather childish at best. And as for racism, I don't think it is natural to be racist. I think it's natural to ask questions. I don't think that automatically implies racism, and I don't think the King or Kate are remotely racist. And the evidence is there in the way that both of them reach out to a diverse community and embrace diversity. As for learning racism, I think there's no better demonstration of that than in a song from South Pacific, and it's a central song in the show. And this 1949 Rodgers and Hammerstein show. All the Rodgers and Hammerstein shows are very edgy, particularly shows like Carousel, which deals with domestic abuse, but also South Pacific. And I think often when one thinks of Rodgers and Hammerstein, one thinks of the more saccharine Sound of Music, but the Sound of Music is also edgy. It's a musical based about the rise of Nazi Germany. And it's dealing with issues of vocation. It's dealing with issues about religious life. These are not the subjects for a conventional musical. And Rodgers and Hammerstein were very driven by the mood of the times, by the questions of the times. And I can't think of a musical that better sums up the movement in the Catholic Church, for example, than The Sound of Music in the 1950s into the 1960s, and the questioning of the permanence of a religious vocation. There it is, up on the screen, in the theatres, and put to intensely beautiful music. And you don't notice the deeper questions that are going on beneath the surface. As for South Pacific, this song, You've Got to Be Carefully Taught. It was greatly criticised at the time, and I think I think some states in America, Georgia, I think in particular, took offence and didn't want the show to tour. They wanted to outlaw that show because it contained a song which they said was inspired by the philosophy of Moscow. Well, it's good that Moscow can do something. A song justifying interracial marriage was implicitly a threat to the American way of life. And thankfully, that is no longer the American way of life. Thankfully, that idea of segregation, that idea of institutional racism has been spurned, but it's taken time. And the song is very clear. You've got to be taught to be prejudiced. Prejudice does not come naturally. And I don't believe that the king is remotely prejudiced. I also believe that this story has been whipped up. And I think it's interesting that it isn't something that the Duke of Sussex, that Prince Harry put into his book. It isn't there. It isn't there in Spare. So if it isn't in Spare, it's no longer relevant. Maybe there was frustration, maybe there was anger at one point. But I think it's gone. And I think at a time when the king is clearly building bridges, for Omid Scobie to be so gleefully applying a torch is inappropriate. We should be helping mend bridges, mend fences, all those metaphors, rather than enjoying the spectacle, the sort of Nero instinct of watching it all burn. We should be nursing our institutions and supporting our institutions. That may mean occasionally that we need to change the personalities who are inhabiting them, but and we may have to criticize in order to do that, but essentially we should be nurturing. And I don't think there really isn't an alternative to the king, and I don't think we should have one. I think that is where we are, and we need to make it work. And that is the position we're in. And I think I would say the same thing about the present government. We need to make it work, because we've got to put up with it for the next year anyway. And calling for a general election, calling for Rishi Sunak's replacement is an absurdity. Recognising that he's a twit at the moment, I think is a good thing. I think if he stops and reconsiders his position and his absurd knee-jerk responses to things, there's time for change. There's room for change. There's always room for change. In the case of the king, I don't think the change is something he needs to make. I think it's a change that people around him may have to make, but not the king. The king is right. And this is a trumped up problem that shouldn't really be given the time of day. It is, so we have to deal with it, and pretending it doesn't exist is a way to perpetuate speculation and to develop this problem. This problem needs to be put away as fast as possible. And I'm sure the king's first instinct is to get on with business and to continue doing what he does, which is reaching out to people across the world, across our country, which is by definition a demonstration of a non-racist personality. It is a demonstration that this allegation is absurd.